Hi, I'm Bill Bradley. Join me for a recent excerpt of American Voices. A few years ago, we heard from author Margaret Bradham Thornton on her debut novel. It was called Charleston. Today she's back to talk about her new book, A Theory of Love, a novel. Before becoming a fiction writer, Thornton had worked on Wall Street. Then she edited the acclaimed Tennessee Williams Notebooks, which won her the Bronze Forward Magazine Book of the Year. Margaret Bradham Thornton joins me now in the Sirius studios. Margaret, wonderful to have you back on American Voices.
Thank you so much.
So, Charleston, what a great novel that was. I still have your descriptions of the marshlands in my mind, you know. Were you thinking about a theory of love while you were writing Charleston, or how does it work?
Well, only in the most sort of vague sense. My friends who are writers said the best advice they could give me is to start something immediately. So I just happened to be walking on the beach one day, and I saw a seagull that was in the dunes, and I went up to it. It wasn't moving. I thought it had a broken wing, and it clearly was in distress. And I saw fear in its eyes, and I moved away. It turned out it was dying. And it made me think as I walked away how animals die by themselves and how different most animals' lives are to the human condition, where we want to be with partners. And it made me wonder about, you know, that quality about all of us. And it's fairly universal. I mean, you look at China, you look at the West, and the languages are very different, the cultures are very different, and yet there's a desire to have a partner. So I began thinking about what does it mean to love someone. At the same time, I traveled to Cuba and was absolutely amazed by Havana, just the beauty and the ambition of that city. Having grown up in Charleston, that was the fourth largest city in America in the 18th and 19th century, it just struck me that the ambition and the wealth of Havana was 100 times what Charleston had.
This was many years ago.
Sure, in the 1800s and 1900s.
Right.
So I wanted to read some accounts of life in Havana during that period, and I contacted an antiquarian book dealer in New Haven, but he had really nothing except a memoir of a circus performer. So I ordered that, and it was not what I expected, but it ended up influencing my book.
Yeah, in a big way.
Yes.
The search for this circus performer in Cuba really gives one of your characters a real moment of insight. So you have two main characters, Christopher, who is in the financial world, wheeler-dealer type, but also has a deep morality, and Helen, who's a journalist. Why did you pick somebody in finance and a journalist to begin to talk about the relationships between two people and about marriage and about difficulties and great times?
Well, working 10 years on Tennessee Williams, he always wrote about longing and not about love. So that was also sort of the background to my being curious about this topic, because for me, writing is about asking questions and not maybe answering them, but exploring them. But Christopher really came from the circus performer. And I thought when I started, I was going to write much more about John Glenroy.
And John Glenroy
was the circus performer. And he had been orphaned as a baby. And when he was 7 in Baltimore, he was doing gymnastic tricks for his friends, entertaining them on the street. And a circus owner came along and asked his foster mother if he wanted to join the circus. He thought he was going to a life of adventure, so, everyone said yes. But it was not a life of adventure. And from his memoir, which I was very moved by, it was just this very flat, unemotional accounting of his travels with all the people he had ever performed with. So he really made me think about the issue, if as a child you never had love, what could you hope to be as an adult? So that's where Christopher came from. The circus was very fast-moving. They were in a different town almost every week. So I thought finance, fast-moving finance would be a great, circus of the 21st century.
Right.
And I also, having worked in finance, I personally think it's much more complicated and nuanced than you see on television or in the movies. And I wanted to write against the stereotype of sort of wheeler dealers, to say there are some very, thoughtful, moral people. I also wanted to talk about the edge between sort of breaking the spirit and breaking the letter of the law.
So when you write this, are these characters just out of your imagination, or are they situations, circumstances, people you've observed and noted specifically? How do you create these characters?
Well, having worked on Wall Street, I know how people talk. I know how people discuss deals. I know the kind of energy level. So I could write about that.
So what did you do on Wall Street?
Well, I first worked in mergers and acquisitions, and then I went to business school, and I came back and worked in debt capital markets and then equity capital markets.
But so how did you get from finance to being a novelist? Or were you always a novelist and you first of all just wanted to pay a few dues?
Well, no, I always loved to write, but I think when I was in my 20s, I felt I really didn't have anything to write about. The question people ask me, how did you end up on Wall Street? And in my defense, I'll say two things. One, I had been an athlete and I'd always played with boys. So when I was in the early 80s, they were considered the toughest jobs to get, getting a job at Goldman Sachs. And I thought, I'm going to give that a shot. So I think feminism with a little F. And then there was a curiosity about that world, which I, having grown up in the South, knew nothing about. And I knew as an English major, the world did not need another essay on Jane Austen from me. So, it just seemed an intriguing thing to do at the time.
So you have such a great way of developing the characters. And you have Helen, who is the female partner here. Now, Helen, she says there are still questions about each other and we don't know the answers to. I guess I always thought I would know everything about the man I married. So what are you trying to tell us about boundaries and relationships?
Well, that line comes from a line from Tennessee Williams. He was in a tussle with Kazan about Brick in Cat on a Hot Tin Roof. And Kazan was pushing Tennessee Williams to really define him. Is he straight? Is he gay? How does he really feel about Maggie? And Tennessee Williams resisted because he said, people are mysterious even to themselves. And the people that we think we know well, we really don't know at all. They aren't close to us. And he was making the point that the closer you get to someone, the less you really know about them. And the further away you are, you think you know them well. So that was really inspired by that conversation between director and playwright.
So, but, sometimes expectations can be excessive, then they crash on reality. And Christopher gets caught up in his business, and drifts apart or doesn't realize he's drifting apart.
Yes.
This happens a lot in life, right?
Yeah, I think it does. And I think, he's older than she was. He's about 10 years older. But I also think that it was exacerbated by his condition being like the circus performer, which is not having been loved as a child. Did he even know how to love as an adult? And I think what I hoped to show at the end was he recognized, as he said, he had been listening from too far away. And that goes to the issue of perspective. And I think the ending is hopeful. Some people, I just got an email from a friend who read it and said, it's just too bad about the ending. And I wrote back, read the last 2 pages again. But I think that I personally think it's hopeful because I think he realizes, how his life really doesn't matter if it's just himself.
I sign on to the hopeful part of this.
Oh, good.
I sign on to it, and toward the end of the novel, you describe a lone osprey, and then you write, humans were different. They needed each other, needed to be recognized, needed to be heard, needed to be touched, needed to share the earth and the sea and the sky to know they were alive. Now, that tells me they're going to get back together.
Or at least try. Right, at least, yeah. I agree. Yeah, well, that's why I wrote what I did. But he understands that, and I think he goes back to her to act on that. But, we don't know.
So what's entanglement theory?
Yeah, I was afraid you were going to ask that.
I mean, you referred to entanglement theory. And as I was reading entanglement theory, is this the entanglement of Christopher and Helen, or the entanglement of the deals, or the entanglement of different lives?
Well, it basically says that two particles can be attached and then separated, and they can be 1,000,000 miles apart from one another. And what happens to one particle happens to the other. And I thought it was a beautiful metaphor for love. I wanted to question that idea. Is that what real love is? I mean, I think it certainly is maternal or paternal love. I mean, I think what happens to our children, I think probably always affects us. It may not be reciprocal, but I thought it was an interesting question to ask with two people who are very different, almost polar opposites, but who love each other and have very different lives. You know, is that what could keep them together?
So do you think that experience, keeps them together?
Well, that they had been very close,
Yeah.
and that even though they had gotten very distant in many ways, emotionally and spiritually, they were still entangled. They were still in love with each other.
Well, thank you very much for coming in and sharing your thoughts about this great new novel.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
I've been talking with Margaret Bradham Thornton about her new novel, A Theory of Love, a novel. To find out more, visit us on Facebook. It's facebook.com/American Voices with Senator Bill Bradley. Thank you for listening to American Voices here on my YouTube channel. For more interviews celebrating the goodness and creativity of the American people, click the subscribe button below.